Just a few housekeeping items before we begin tonight. You are attending the webinar tonight in listen-only mode, so you'll be able to hear us, but we can't hear you. If you have any questions for our presenter, you can type those in on the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will cover the questions at the end of the presentation. I know our presentation is a little longer tonight, so if we don't get to your questions, our presenter, Nick, said that he will email people back with the answers, and we'll give you more information about that. So if you don't see the panel, look for an orange arrow in the upper right corner of your screen. Click on that arrow and it will pop out the panel. And now, please welcome our guest tonight, Nick Schneider. Nick owns and operates the personal chef company, Thrive Chef Works. He is a prolific backyard fruit and vegetable grower and former market gardener for Farm in the City in St. Paul. He's been vermicomposting for 13 years and believes vermicomposting is an excellent energy efficient way for homeowners and gardeners to manage their own food carbon footprint while supporting life in the garden. Thanks for being here tonight, Nick.
Oh, thank you, Laura. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy to be talking to everybody about vermicomposting in the middle of winter. It gets me thinking about warmer days as well. So yeah, I think we're gonna hopefully get in about an hour here with this presentation, and then maybe have some time for questions, hopefully. But please email me if you'd like to follow up with something that isn't covered or you're curious about something. So I guess before I go to the next slide, I'll just say one thing about kind of nomenclature. You might see the word vermicast or the castings throughout this presentation as well, which is, it's pretty much going to be synonymous with vermicomposting, and so those two go hand in hand. And the word vermicast is used by some people to delineate it from actual compost, which is a non-worm compost, for example. So to be more specific. Okay, so let's talk about creating high quality compost at home. And we'll talk a little bit about some reasons why to compost with red worms at home. There's lots of benefits. It's January right now, and you can't really compost outside. Everything is really static, and there's very low amount of microbial activity. There is some, but it's very low. So managing our nutrient waste stream is also really important. And I work in the food business, and so I'm always hearing about other restaurateurs and other folks in industrial food areas that want to take care of stuff and take care of the organic waste and produce something beneficial with it instead of putting it into a landfill, which, as you can see, will create methane. Organic material, when it's put into a landfill, does create methane. Just think of an anaerobic digester. I mean, that's a machine that's very complicated, where they're actually doing things anaerobically and they're capturing the methane to use as a fuel, I think. And then the less we have to move this stuff around, the better, because that all requires, right now, fossil fuel energy to truck it around. So if you can do it at home and keep it local, that's better. This is probably one of the biggest reasons, of course, in my mind, is that it's a natural source of plant fertilizer, and it's got these really incredible plant growth hormones called auxins and cytokines in it, which do really wonderful things. Those come from actually the worms themselves. The worm digestion process produces that. So that's a really nice feature. And then the humic acids, which are kind of gives compost and worm castings the darker color. They're chelators of minerals, and it puts them in a plant available form, which is really important. So they also lead to better water infiltration and storage capacity. There's been a lot of studies done on worm compost, and a lot of studies talking about higher yielding crops, better soil structure, things like that, better water holding capacity. And One thing that I use it for is reducing transplant shock when you add it to the planting or the furrow, for example, the hole, when you're putting in transplants. And I also see a real improved growth there, like a kind of a kickstart when I put it in for my brassica starts. I'm talking about a half cup or so per plant. Vermicast is a good way to add diversity to your whole system in general. And the more different ways you can compost and use them in your garden, the better. You know, leaf mold, wood chip, compost, they all take different rates and different methods, you know. But I think worm composting is a really good one as well, because it just adds to the diversity. Um, Worms actually produce more microbes. They like basically amplify microbes when they consume the food, and so that inside their guts they're like amplifying and producing more microbes. Um, Sorry about that. Um, and one last point is here is that it is a powerful additive, and not much is needed to make a difference. It's very concentrated, and that's one real big strong benefit for a home gardener, for example. You can do it at different levels of your ability and interest, for example. So some of the studies talk about basically they're measuring different levels of vermicast or vermicompost that they put into the soil medium, like replacing the regular soil and putting in this vermicast anywhere from 10 to 60%, and they get important results, pretty good results. So above 60%, the studies have shown that it can be detrimental. So you don't really need that much, for example. So one thing I want listeners to just think about as they go through these slides is like what their goals might be for worm composting, whether you want to, you know, what scale you want to do it at, and what things you want to use it for. Just keep that in the back of your head. And I'm going to be kind of presenting a little bit of information, and that's tangential, and I think that kind of helps. I'm talking about like what they do in, you know, the commercial level worm composting, for example, and just other models that people use. But I'm going to specifically be focusing on your typical one box worm composting at home. So just a little bit of technical information here, I guess, about the worm, Icena fetida. That's really the one that you need to get, and make sure you get that one. Red wigglers or red worms are the most common names you see, really, if you're buying them. But you really don't want to use anything else. In fact, there are a few others, but even worldwide, this one is Icena fetida is the most commonly used. And we're not talking about night crawlers, for example, at all. So this is a completely different kind of worm. They're important too, but they live out in your garden, and they're hibernating right now, way underground. So this is a worm native to Eastern Europe. It's a forest dweller, and it's known as an epigeic worm, which means it's a surface dweller. It lives in the duff, leaf litter, and lives in very rich, a rich layer, for example. And their temperature that they really can survive at is 45 degrees to 85. Now, just a couple quick things in mind. If you have a 95-degree day in Minnesota, just bear in mind that they're living in a very moist medium, and that's going to be cooled by evapotranspiration. So it's not a 95-degree day isn't going to kill them if they're outside in your backyard, as long as they're not in the sun. You know, you just keep them in the shade. The preferred range, though, is 60 to 75. Really, in the 70s is ideal. You know, seems like all biological activity likes it in the 70s, and this is all based on that too. So more on that later. pH is right around neutral to 6.5. So they breathe through their skin, and so that's why they need to have a really moist medium, about 80%. And it sounds like a lot, but as you get doing this, you'll realize that it works out quite well. And there's different ways to observe that and measure it, and just kind of get a feel for it. So This worm is not an invasive one. It's not the one that's harming Minnesota forests. For example, that'd be like the bait worms, for example. This one can't really take advantage of like just regular soil or dirt. It really needs like a compost pile or its own really rich, moist environment. Um, they have really incredible reproductive habits, so it's a good investment, and you don't need very many to start because they will, they will reproduce rather rapidly. One worm can produce 100 offspring after 6 months, and the cocoons take 4 to 6 weeks to hatch, and yeah, so you could be giving them away easily. This is kind of a good practice to do if you start doing it. So we're going to talk about building your typical worm bin. There's lots of different models, and I'm sure if you've gone on Google at all to look at things for sale and what people are doing on YouTube, you'll see different things. So I'll describe kind of what I'm talking about here as a typical one. A typical bin. Starter bin is like 20 to 30 gallon size. You can usually find something like that used, or you can find new ones, of course, in the stores. Get it with a lid. I think having a lid is pretty important, especially if you're going to leave it outside in the summer or take it in out for the summer. And you don't have to do, but I kind of do. I like to do that in a shady area. An opaque box is a pretty good idea, because if the sunlight can go through it, even if it's white or something, that's not good for the worms. They're going to just retreat from. They're just going to move to the center. So a wood box will work, but they're kind of tedious and a little bit more. There's a little bit more to managing them. Like if you use plywood, it will delaminate. Some people talk about using marine plywood, which is treated. Just that's your own call. I don't particularly like to use treated lumber for anything in the garden or something like that. So one time I did build a bin out of cedar, and it was a mistake because the cedar is the wrong kind of wood to use, because of the oils in them are really, the worms do not like those oils. They're kind of strong, and it also came apart in the rain. So this is an important part that is a small sheet of plastic or poly cut to the inside dimensions is usually put right inside for the top layer. Apologize for that part of the slide, but you can use newspaper, for example, or cardboard for that very same thing. You could even use large cabbage leaves. This creates a condensation point, which is really valuable, and for helping to conserve and manage the moisture. So you also want to make sure the airflow is really important around the worm bin, getting it up, because it's going to have holes on the bottom. You want to get it up off the floor or the ground or whatever wherever you have it. Just get some air movement underneath it. Propping it up on something is a good idea. So all these bins, for example, should have holes in them to allow for some air to move around. And so you can see here where it's advised to put holes below the lid, a couple inches below the lid. Anywhere from a quarter to a half inch is fine. I think airing on the larger side is probably better, and also putting them in the bottom, because you definitely don't want. That's probably the most important. Is you want these things to be able to drain, and that's where the leachate, or the worm tea as it's sometimes called, comes out. And then we'll talk a little bit about these bottomless flow-through bins that you may have seen online, for example. And the ventilation is more important than typo there. Sorry, than keeping flies out. And we'll talk more about flies later. Flies are not really something to be too concerned about with the proper management. There's ways around that. So I guess if you're keeping your bin outside, you don't want them, I wouldn't want the bins large, or the holes in the bin to be large enough to allow a mouse to get into. So keep that in mind. Uh, some people install vent grates on the side so you can get some real airflow. Uh, that's an easy thing to do as well. And you can also build, you can use screening, for example, so you can get creative. And let's see here, some things to talk about just kind of as we get started about the management aspects. You're kind of controlling these factors: moisture, temperature, bedding, feeding rate, types of food. And I'll start by talking a little bit about this idea about bedding, sometimes called the media or the matrix. My preferred term is the matrix. Um, um, it has a lot of different functions and different ingredients as well. And some of the functions are, it acts like a sponge to hold the water, and the high carbon, C is for carbon, high carbon portion or the bulk of the matrix. It's the media for a sort of movement, warm movement. It's like kind of a housing. It holds the calcium for reproduction, and we're going to go into each of these a little bit finer in the next few slides. Fine sand for the worm, gizzards. I'm not sure if gizzards is the technical word, but essentially they have they need it in their gut to grind and digest the food a little bit, and you don't need very much. This bedding, which is the high carbon material, also balances out the high nitrogen food scraps that you're going to be putting in. And the worms can eat the brown material or the high carbon material as not as nutritious for them, but it's a low grade food source. But it's important that they have that there. Coffee grounds are a really good starter food, and they're the ideal consistency. So keep that in mind. I'd like to have some of that in the starter matrix. A little bit of compost inoculation, really important, because it's really good to get basically compost microbes into your bin, and we'll elaborate on that. And then also by kind of having this high carbon bedding, you have a place to bury food scraps. So I say all this to say that you can't really start a bin with just a bunch of food scraps chopped up very fine. It could heat up, it could get very anaerobic and get very wet rather quickly. So yeah. All right, ingredients for a healthy starting matrix. So now I'll get into some more numbers. This is for a bin that's approximately 25 inches wide, 15 inches high, 15 inches deep. And that's a good size because you can lift that even when it's kind of half full. It's still a little heavy, but you want to build this around what your ability is to move these things. And you could have more than one if you needed. But there's a lot of water in there, so it can get heavy. So you want to go 6 inches deep with a high carbon bulk material that you've already hydrated. You can do that in another large container, for example, a trash can or a bus tub or a basement sink. And some of the high carbon forms that you might be using are shredded cardboard, peat moss, coconut coir, half or more decomposed wood chips, which is I like to use that. Leaves, and I'll say a bit about leaves in a second. Leaf mold is probably ideal too. Compost itself, that's what the commercial worm composters do. A newspaper is sometimes talked about as a possible carbon form, but I really avoid that. I've had really bad experiences myself, and that was my first big learning mistake, is to use newspaper. And from what I learned from Ellen Sendelbach in Duluth, who does education on worm composting, that there's clay in the type in the ink or the type on newspaper, and that clay just makes it too mushy and makes it resist airflow and drying out, and it just could make it makes the bin go anaerobic, which is what you're trying to avoid. Handful of compost from the outside bin. If you don't have any of that, just use garden soil. You need some fine sand, just a small amount. If you don't have that, just use gardens, garden soil. Usually around here, a lot of the soils are um, sandy loam, so there's plenty of sand in there. And then they need some calcium for reproduction, and that could come in the form of oyster shells and or pulverized eggshells. Or agricultural lime, which is those things are available in any gardening store. But I used pulverized eggshells for years. I used them I did that in a food processor. Just bear in mind it kind of can wreak havoc with the food processor. And it makes quite a fine powder. And brewed coffee grounds also great for the starter, about 1 pound there. So you're seeing all these numbers here, and that's kind of like good proportions to each other. That's a good thing to record. But coffee grounds could be a lot. I mean, that's an incredible ingredient. Food scraps to start, 1/2 pound to 3/4 pound. You really want to start on the small side, and we'll get into that here. So one critical point that's often overlooked when you're starting a bin and add worms, someone starts a bin and they add worms right away, and there can easily be like what's called a worm exodus, where all the worms are basically crawling out through the holes. They're just trying to get out. I've seen this before, and the bin ideally needs to be set up and fed 1 to 2 weeks prior to adding the worms, and you can call this kind of priming or charging the bin. Other reasons for like a mass worm exodus would be that it's too wet, it's producing ammonia, it's too acidic, too much different kinds of adverse foods like garlic and onions and things. And so here's the point that I want to make here is that the worm bin works on the same principles as an outdoor compost. Not a thermophilic one, and you're not heating up the bin. It's not going to heat up. That would actually kill the worms. It's a cold composting process, but it's a dynamic microbial and critter ecosystem at work here. And what's happening is the worms eat or graze on the protozoa who are eating the bacteria who are eating your food scraps. So it's a whole food chain that's happening inside the bin. By letting it compost ahead a couple weeks, you ensure that the food will be ready in a ready state for the worms when they arrive. So this is actually how commercial worm composters deal with food scraps, is they just compost it 6 months to a year ahead of time, and they feed the worms compost, and then that turns into vermicompost. It's a much more streamlined and easy way to do things when you're doing them by the ton, for example. But there's actually no reason why you can't do that at home either. In a bin, you might eventually find other tiny harmless soil bugs that help in the decomposition process. And just a couple of these to list are little white springtails and a tiny white mite. It's called orbitid mites, for example. And they can be common, and they're not something to be concerned with. All right, moving on. So we're going to look a little bit closer at each of the ingredients, because you have some choices to make when you're starting a bin about which might be, better for you or what you might have available, for example. So that high carbon portion of the matrix needs to be hydrated before you add it to the bin. That's really important. And it needs to be at about like 80% moisture. That's normal. It's that 4 to 5 inch layer that needs to be the 80% level, and sometimes the bottom of the bin can be drier, especially in a bottomless flow through worm bin. So you want to soak the coconut core fast and easy and uniform. These are some benefits of it. For example, it's got a neutral pH, although it has a wide, pretty high carbon footprint, transport miles involved there. But the agroforestry, as I understand it in Southeast Asia, it's not that bad. It's on the sustainable side of things. They don't use a lot of pesticides in agroforestry, for example. That being said, you got some other pretty good options here too. But peat, slightly acidic, pH a bit messier, doesn't regulate water as well as coconut core, and it's more environmentally sensitive. And so it's an option and people use it, and you might consider it. But you can also look at shredded cardboard, very common. People hand tear it up, or they cut it up, or they, will use a machine, for example. That requires a little bit of looking into. The worms really like the corrugated part because it has the holes that they can kind of hide in, go in, travel through. It's a little bit of time and to prep this stuff, but it's very abundant locally. Glues are a big question. It can be anybody's guess what's in one glue versus the next cardboard. So I personally I don't use it because I'm also kind of, I don't want to put the kind of prep in for tearing it up, for example. It used to be that cardboard had like horse-based glue, and nowadays it's all over the map. So it can be some more chemical-laden stuff. Egg cartons are easy and fast to prep, and there's likely no glues. Don't use ones without any ink on them, for example. Newspaper, again, I would avoid it. I think I said what I said earlier about that. So white office paper, some people use it with no problems, and other people have die-offs, and it's possibly because of toxins, which are called dioxins. It's hard to know exactly in any given office paper how it's been bleached, whether just plain oxygen or dioxins or stuff that's going to be harmful to the worms. That being said, people often talk about how these composting processes involving, for example, worms and mushrooms and things, fungi, will often neutralize toxins. Dried leaves, this is a really good additive I recommend using with other ingredients, not exclusively. Shredded leaves can mat down, and that can limit airflow, leading to a slightly anaerobic condition. I've used maple for this. Other species might fare different, so you can experiment there. You could also make leaf mold, which is leaf compost, and I think that would work beautifully, actually. I use wood chips that have been decomposed partly or all the way. They work really well. And when you think about it, this is a lot like coconut coir, and it's a very similar kind of material, kind of texture as well. But you got to plan ahead, because that can take 6 months to a year to get something of the quality and texture that you want for worms to be in, and that can hold moisture, for example. Compost itself. Growing Power in Milwaukee feeds their worms compost they make on site, and this is how commercial worm growers do it. So leaf mold, and I've talked about that. I think it's a good choice. The compost, you just need a small amount as an inoculant. It can be from outside. But it's an important part of the additive. Sand, it's used for digestion and kind of grinding food in the worm's gut. Brewed coffee beans are an ideal food source, and also kind of medium. And just bear in mind that the acid is leached out when the drink is made. And you can get this stuff in bulk sometimes if you talk to cafe owners or baristas, for example, in the summer when they make cold brew in cafes. It's in huge batches, and you could get like 20 pounds at a time if you were in the right place at the right time. Calcium, really important for worm production. You don't need very much. The food scraps. Now this is where we talk about the real importance of what you're putting in there. That's kind of your byproduct of your kitchen. There's most things that they're going to eat just fine, but there's some things you'll need to avoid giving them, or in very small amounts. Most fruits and vegetables, melons, especially tropical fruits, are great. High energy foods, those are high energy foods, for example. Coffee grounds, tea bags. You could do coffee filters. This is just like the bedding material, for example. Cooked foods can go in as long as they're not too spicy, and they're limited on oils and salts. The less salty, the better. The worms really don't like too much salt. And the cooked foods can contain more water, so you got to keep that in mind in the way you distribute that and how much you add. All right. and grains and pastas, of course, can be a little moldy if they're not buried. Foods that you want to outright avoid are citrus peels, onion family, meat, dairy, oily foods, vinegar tinged foods, and obviously no human or animal waste. Now, commercially, what they do is their preferred feedstocks are cow manure and hog manure and things like that, but they're aged, they're composted, and so they're safe to use, and they're not, quote, hot anymore. And if you wanted to experiment on a small scale at home, you could use aged manure just fine. Something you bought at the store, for example. Some foods that break down very slowly, and you might want to avoid adding for that reason, are ginger and radicchio. Large pieces of food, now those obviously can be chopped down, and the surface area is a really important factor here. The smaller you chop things, the faster they're going to decompose. And I know that because I tend to not chop them that well, and or at all sometimes, and I just let the clock work on it and let them finally decompose. And the peels of avocados and mango pits, of course, will be sifted out. Some things will be sifted out, you know, when you are at the end game there with that. So we're going to talk about some binge arrangements and feeding flow, because this kind of gets into how you manage it, how you feed it in a way that gets it working in a healthy manner and avoids some problems that you might have. So vertical feeding or a flow through is one way, and then horizontal feeding is another. And the horizontal feeding tends to be how commercial worm composters do things, because they got the space, and you also can't have a giant pile of worm compost. It's just antithetical to the way that they live as a surface dweller. So with vertical feeding, like I was saying before, you put in you know, somewhere around 6 inches of bedding, and then you bedding in the matrix, and then you can add your food to that. And I'm showing here that you can kind of build upwards in the last half to 2/3 of your bin, and so we'll take a look at some different vantage points in the next slide. So here's just showing you that you have to have a drip tray underneath it, because you will sometimes get water or leachate or worm tea coming out of it. And a plastic layer is quite good for that condensation. That's the thin black line. The green olive one is the dried leaves, whole or shredded. And I like to keep a bag of leaves next to my bin, and I'll use them as a sort of a duff layer, and they break down rather quickly with the condensation on them from the plastic. And then you have the worms in the bedding matrix just below that. There we go. And then we're going to look at the next model below. I have is more of a, you see those white lines suggest that you're dividing it into a horizontal manner. So you're feeding on the far left, and then you're feeding on the second to the left, and then the third to the left and fourth to the left, sequentially. So you're moving the food into different zones each time you come down to put the scraps in. All right, and we'll explain that in a moment here. So here's a picture of a bin that I run at home in a basement. I've got the leaves nearby as an accessory, utility bucket, things like that. Well, work light's nice to have, because you'll get the worms to kind of retreat and get away from you if you're working in there or adding something, and see what you're doing for one. Note that this is off the floor, and it's just easier on your back, and it's avoiding the coldest area too by a small amount, I bet. And airflow, like I said before, airflow is really important. So here's a top view, and this is just showing worms they kind of cluster around really nice food products, like, you know, a decomposing fruit or something like that. They'll almost, you know, mob graze it, and you can find clusters that way. If you need to give worms away to a friend, I'll sometimes put in a banana in there, and then a week later you can just grab a couple hundred worms in one go and give them away. So yeah, and on the right, you're just showing you the plastic that is down there for the condensation layer. And then normally I would put leaves there. On this particular bin I don't have because it's near finishing. I'm trying to finish it. So and there's the amount of food scraps I probably do at a time. It's chopped up, easy to distribute. It's about almost a quart. Here's the number one mistake in home worm composting is that you're feeding too often. And think about every time you're feeding is you're adding water, and what you're trying to do is manage the water and make sure it doesn't go anaerobic. And when there's too much water in a system, in the soil, for example, a compost bin, it can go anaerobic if it doesn't have that ratio of airflow to the water. For example, it doesn't have good gas exchange essentially, and the anaerobic microbes will take over, and then you'll get that smell that you don't like, and that's the first indicator that something's wrong. You're overfeeding, for example. So what I always tell people at the beginning is don't when at the very beginning, just feed it slowly, ramp it up slowly. While you get more and more microbes in there, it should be able, and more worms, you should be able to take more food, for example. So like I said before, it needs to mature a little bit before it can accept higher quality of foods. Feeding too often can often lead to overly wet or anaerobic bin. That's something very important to keep in mind. So I like to tell people not to feed by a schedule per se, like a strict schedule. I'd rather use just observe. Use your empirical observations to see if the food is gone or almost gone before you go ahead and feed a different zone. Because if you're putting it, you're just putting it in without the rest of it being decomposed, it could eventually be start to go anaerobic. So here's like a top view of the bin with different zones, and you can just think of it as sixes or thirds or however you want to divide it, really, depending on the size of the bin. And so the feed zones are you want in these particular size zones, it would be like 1 to 1.5 pounds of food per week, and then you want to rotate that. And I wouldn't try 1.5 pounds right when your bin is brand new. I would let it mature just a little bit and get going. And we talked about charging the bin or letting it, get the microbes going first. So here's a bit about worms eat about half their body weight in a day. 1,000 worms is approximately half a pound. You can use this as a rough guide, but do go by like observation. And remember that it's a living system influenced by many, many interlocking factors. So it's something we got to keep an eye on. And so the rate of worms eating of the scraps, that's an important thing to think about here. And just wrap your head around when you have one of these bins at home. It's greatly influenced by temperature. So it means a basement winter bin, and maybe 62 to 65 will not consume as fast as an outdoor bin in a shaded area. I find that in the summer, my bin outside, I can feed it a lot more. It'll take a lot more scraps, for example. It just devours food scraps. I haven't used a bin under the kitchen sink, so I'm not sure how well those work. That's usually not a very big area. 70 degrees is like a sweet spot for all biological activity. The surface area, really important. Greater surface area means a greater microbial activity and hence more worm feeding. Some people cut up their scraps to smaller sizes. Worms love coffee grounds and juice pulp, which are already kind of a large surface area. You could also just crush the food scraps outside next to a garden, for example, like crush them with what would be like a a soil pounder, for example, for lane pavement, for example, class 5 gravel. You can freeze the scraps as well. That will hasten the breakdown. Just remember, don't add them cold. You got to let them come back to room temperature before you add them to the bin, because that'll be bad for the worms. The size of the bin and the number of worms will affect the amount of food needed. So as I was telling you, my bin in the summer, it eats a lot more, and the worm population just explodes by the end of the summer and the early fall. And something to keep in mind is if you go on vacation, for example, for a few weeks, you're fine. The worms can survive a while without food scraps. If you're leaving for a month or two, you might want to think about having somebody feed it there. In fact, you should. Starting out with red wigglers. So just make sure that when you're buying them, that you're just actually getting red wigglers and Isienda fetida, for example, and not something else. Some places I've listed here where you can buy them online and locally. They're actually up to $40 a pound now, which is I thought was kind of expensive. And when I've bought them in the past, it was more like $20 a pound, but that's been some years ago. So it appears that they're becoming in more demand. If your household is a heavy food scrap producer, you should consider starting with 2 pounds versus 1, and that will allow you to feed a higher rate early on. I would advise that. If you're have a scratch kitchen and you're making lots of vegetables and vegetarian cooking, for example, you're gonna have a lot of scraps. I can't come anywhere close to dealing with all my kitchen scraps in the winter, for example, because I just have the one bin in the winter and it's colder and it's in my basement. And I've calculated that I also am a professional chef, so I end up with scraps from my clients. And so I ended up with the scraps for a substantially larger household, really. So I would need a 2-foot by 7-foot bed to deal with all that, which I don't have. I just have a regular bin that I described earlier. After 3 months, will increase 100-fold. It could 3 to 6 months, depending on conditions, like I was saying before. If they're outdoors in the summer, expect large numbers by July and onward. If you keep feeding them, populations will regulate themselves to the feeding rates over time. So if you slow the feeding down or stop, the populations will go down and the worms will decompose in there very rapidly because they're a high protein source and you won't ever really find a dead worm in there. So for example, a 2-foot by 4-foot by 12-inch box is likely too small for a busy household of two-person family with lots of vegetables in their diet and scratch cooking. So management of water in a bin, and this is something that's really important as well. As you add more scraps, you will probably need to add more bedding in some fashion or another. And you can do that by 2 ways. You can layer it in with the food scraps, like I was talking about, like when you put food scraps in, also put in a layer of leaves underneath the plastic, and that will break down and become sort of, that's more brown matter that'll break down quickly because of the condensation. Or you can kind of fold in or lightly fluff in with your hands any of the carbon forms that we talked about earlier. And if as you see your bin getting more and more mature, it's going to get fuller and fuller of worm castings. And as that does that, it's going to need a recharge. It's going to need a more carbon source, because the worms they don't want to live in their own castings, even though they can. So the water level should really be up near 80%. I mean, 50% they would be fine, but 80 is more ideal. And now, if you do this correctly, you really shouldn't have worm tea liquid coming out the bottom. A lot of people do, and I have had at times, but you just want to ventilate and make sure that you have the right, and enough of the brown matter, the high carbon matter, for example. that's where the bottomless flow-through bins that you see sometimes online might have an advantage, because there's actually quite a bit of airflow on that bottom there. The liquid issuing from the bottom can indicate that the food scraps are too watery, too many food scraps, or there's not enough brown matter. And the brown matter that helps regulate the water greatly, for example. So you can add more of that if you see that happening too much. And a piece of plastic or some poly over the top of the bedding will help regulate moisture. Some people, if they have the worm tea and they don't want to have that coming out, they will use paper or something other than plastic, which can allow more airflow. But that condensation layer is really attractive to the worms, for example. All right, so starting a new bin, you'd use 1 to 1.5 pounds of dry brown matter or bedding material per cubic foot of bin. That's kind of a good ratio to think about when you do some calculations. Just typical home bin is 4 to 6 cubic feet. It should be very moist, not dripping. So if you squeeze it and it's like dripping water, it probably means it's too wet, and you can let it drain a little longer. Fortunately, I think some of these brown matters, for example, like the coconut core that I've used and the wood chip compost, is they tend to like really hydrate at the perfect level, you know. You can just keep something else that you can work in and make a big mess in nearby to do this, like a tote or a bus tub, because you're going to need space to mix stuff. So once it comes time to harvesting the red worms, you generally don't want to leave the worms in their castings for too long. As I just mentioned, like 6 months is probably the longest before you want to go to regenerate or recoup the bin. Best to harvest the castings and regenerate the box once each 4 or 5 months. You could do it sooner too if you wanted even. Be aware of how heavy the bin will be, of course. So some people, they divide it and have 2 bins because it just can be quite heavy. I have had others help me move a bin before. Sizing of the bins is important to match to your ability, for example. And you can have as many bins as you want if you want to manage the weight that way, for example. So here's an important piece: is before you want to harvest a section or an entire bin, you really want to stop feeding that area for 30 days, even more per se, but about 30 days, and the worms will move out of that area and look for food elsewhere. So there's 3 ways you can kind of we consider harvest methods. So the first method is a tarp on and a light, tarp and light method, and you're basically just laying it out a tarp, and you empty the bin onto it, and you make many small pyramids with castings, using your hands to protect the worms. You're just working carefully with them. I wouldn't work with a tool like a shovel or something. You could cut worms up. And you want to use, you can use daylight or a light. I wouldn't put them in direct sunshine though. Like a garage would be fine, or the shade. Plenty of direct light, or plenty of light that they're gonna basically move away from. The worms will dive to avoid the light, and then you scoop off the top of the pyramid, and then you recombine the pyramids until you have fewer and fewer, and repeat this process of removing the tops of the pyramids. And this can be a little bit time consuming. This could take you an hour or 2. I'm not sure exactly. I've done it a couple of times a long time ago. It's not my preferred method anymore, but it works. So you leave the worms in some castings for the next bedding, for example, for your next bin. Fruit flies, dealing with fruit flies, for example. Fruit flies come in with bananas usually and other fruit, and banana peels need to be buried in the bedding. Flies can't burrow in to lay their eggs. Additionally, you can keep flies from entering your kitchen or basement by keeping it covered with some plastic agricultural fabric, which is a breathable fabric. Trade name is Remay, or it's a spun polypropylene fabric you can get through garden supply stores, and that would be one way to keep flies from entering the bin. But yeah, here's some other flies that you might see. Vinegar flies are larger than fruit flies. Straw flies can come in with straw, and they're even larger yet. And they have this habit of flying in a square pattern. I've only seen these by the one or two, not a big nuisance, and not, it was a long time ago, really isolated episode. You can vacuum up flies with an extension and a vacuum if they're on your ceiling, for example. But just if you bury the food scraps, you really shouldn't have a problem. Okay, sorry, that got inserted into the harvest method chronology here. So back to harvest methods. The second method, I call it the migration method. And you use this method to remove up to 50 to 75% of the castings at a time. On one area slated for harvest, you can see in the photo on the left, you've removed the plastic, and you leave that off for about 30 days, and you don't feed that area for about the 30 days. And so in this picture on the left, the plastic would have been over the leaves only. In the bin below, I use plastic and leaves only on the side on the right, for example, that's being actively fed. This can take more than 30 days, but realize you might not have not 100% of the food composted. There are some things that are resilient and take a little more time. And don't worry if you have a few worms remaining in the harvest zone. I would just accept it. Wouldn't try to get every last worm. Sometimes I'll use specifically I'll use rotten fruit for trying to get them to migrate faster. They're just a food that they really like. And here's an example on the right. You'll see where I've shoveled out a lot of worm compost and left half of it intact. And here's an alternative migration method. So this would be for a long bin. Bins vary in that they're a long, narrow one is used, or if it's outside, it can be a long windrow pile. So like this is how, for example, commercial style vermicomposting is done. And this is a very shallow process. That would be like 1 foot high, maybe 2 feet at most. But it takes up a lot of surface area because they spread it out. And it's like a trough, for example. In fact, those animal feeding troughs, you can get those. They're generally around like 2 foot wide by 8 to 10 foot wide long, and usually 18 inches deep or so. And I know someone who put that on wheels and stores it in his attached garage, and works very convenient for doing it on a, I would say semi-large homeowner scale. So this diagram just shows like how you would move the feeding zone along, and you would get castings on the left and you'd be moving into the bedding, and then you can go back in the other direction. So and then this is a method that some people use. It's called the extinction method, and it really makes sense if you have more than one bin, because if you're using the extinction method and you only have one bin, you're basically getting rid of your livestock because they're dying out. And what you do is you simply let the bin finish by stopping the feeding for 30 to 60 days. The worms end up dying in the bin. It's less work, but if you sacrifice your livestock, it takes more time. To build them up again. For example, to go from 1 pound to however many you might have in the end of a year. I've seen this work more with bins for a low worm population. Like if someone has multiple bins that have very few worms in them, or less worms than I might have, it would not work well for my bins because I tend to keep a fairly high population of worms in there. And also I'm a little bit averse to just letting them die off like that. Done in situations with multiple bins, this works great in rotation or in a circuit. Circuit of use and maintenance in smaller bins. And using red worms and their castings. There's been a lot of studies that show the increased yield and fruiting or root growth when you use anywhere from 10 to 60% of the growing media as castings. If you just go to Google Scholar and you type in vermicast effects on plants, you'll come up with tens of thousands of hits, from scientific literature, scientific articles. It's been widely studied worldwide. You can add up to like approximately a half cup to a transplanting hole in the spring. I noticed the increased growth and vigor when I have done these experiments in my own garden. You can work them directly into garden soil. You can side dress in the mid-season for garden plants. I would advise putting it underneath mulch to protect it from UVs and drying out. The more you can keep it kind of alive, the better. You can make a liquid tea extract and water plants and seedlings with it. And so what I would do for what I call a liquid tea extract is just take a handful of castings and put them into a bucket, rainwater if you have it, and then mix well for 10 seconds. Just mix it really well, and then water the plants or the seeds. You can strain it first, depending on your watering device, so you don't clog up the watering can, for example. But you want to use this really immediately because you don't want it to go anaerobic, for example. And you want the biology to be delivered alive. That's really critical to the process. The top dress indoor house plants, you can use the worm, liquid worm compost extract, which we just described, for watering your indoor plants. I do that, for example. You can add worms to your outdoor compost once it's gone through that thermophilic phase and it's cooled down. I usually do this in about mid to late summer when it looks like the compost can hold worms, for example. And you'll find that worms go in there anyway from the ground up. But I always add some, I just add more just to kind of amplify the worm activity in the compost. And they'll work on the rest of that compost for the rest of the warm season. And then the other thing I'm planning on doing with them this season is using them as duck feed. And I've expanded my system a little bit, and so I'm going to make use of the ample food scraps that I end up getting to produce more protein for some ducks that I'm having in my backyard. Because I don't have a pasture, I'm kind of trying to grow the pasture food for them, at least the insect part of it. So this is a quick example. We're getting near the end here. So this is the quick example of doing vermicast for sprouts or microgreens at home. Growing Power is in Milwaukee. It's a nonprofit, an urban farm that produces really high levels of sprouts and microgreens and baby dandelion from a vermicast system. So typically they'll use like your planting tray. It's about 11 inches by 18 roughly. It's a seed starting tray and it's perforated so it drains. And you'll take that and you put 50% vermicast that has been screened in a 1/4 inch hardware cloth, for example. We'll make it really consistent. And then 50% coconut coir that has been hydrated and also screened in that 1/4 inch hardware cloth. You could try leaf mold as well. You wouldn't have to screen leaf mold. Wood chip compost you might have to screen. Could be a little bit chunky, but you could use those as an alternative coconut coir, I believe. So you mix that well, and then you put a single layer of these thick, these larger seeds. For example, which peas, pea shoots, peas, and sunflowers. That's what I'm thinking of. And then a 1/4 inch layer of whatever carbon material you were using. It could be the coconut coir or the leaf mold or the wood chips compost that's hydrated, and you just cover that kind of barely and mist to spray. And then you can stack these trays up, and as they germinate, one will push up the next. I wouldn't stack them too high really, maybe 3. And it's pretty amazing to see that happen because they come up really dense sprouts, really dense, and then you can sell that, you can eat it, give it away, you can do all kinds of things. And that's when you need to give them light when they sprout, of course, and spread them out. Yeah, and it's a very valuable way to do cut and come again dandelion, baby dandelion, or lettuces too. So this is some further information that we'll just leave up here. I guess we have a few minutes for questions, possibly. Lara, are you
I am
there?
here,
Okay.
and we do have a couple of questions here. Wow, that was a lot of really fascinating information. Thank you so much, Nick.
Mm-hmm.
One question I have from someone is, have you heard of Laverme's worms? And I do see her on this list
Yeah,
here.
yeah. I have
Um,
visited her. So if you want to know more about how she does it, I could talk about that if that's what you're wondering about.
yeah, and then the rest of the question, and do you know if she's still in business up here in the Duluth area?
I haven't talked to her or heard about her in probably 8 years or more, so I don't know the answer to that. Um, she was doing education in the Duluth area um, for a long time, I believe, and she had a really interesting bin that she kept in a shed outside that was completely insulated with straw bales and just heated with a light bulb, and it was fine all winter. And her bin was like an animal watering tub, many gallons. It probably was 300, 400 gallons. And it was just a gigantic bin that she kept in there, and it didn't smell bad at all or anything. I was pretty impressed. Um, and she had quite a big garden too. So she tends to favor the kind of bin that I just talked about, and not the flow through bins or the stackable kinds of flow through bins where the worms migrate upwards.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, I think you addressed this in the beginning, but what would the optimum temperature for a vermicomposting bucket inside my house be?
I would say probably 70 to 75, or right around 75. Um, you know, yeah, I think it's all based on how when does the most microbial activity occur, and 70s is a really good sweet spot.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Nick.
Hmm.
We do have some people asking for the recording, and I will send that out within the next day or two. And we do have a couple of people who asked for slides. I'm not sure if
Hmm.
that's something you could share, but
Yeah.
okay. So Nick's email address again is ns.schneider@me.com. And Nick said he's happy to answer any more questions. And if you would like a copy of the slides, you could email him. Is that correct, Nick,
Yeah.
for copies? Okay, well, thanks again, Nick, and thank you everyone for attending tonight's webinar. If you have any other questions regarding the webinar, please contact me, Lara. Once you leave tonight's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide us with feedback. So on the behalf of the Minnesota State Horticultural Society and our presenter, Nick, thank you for joining us and have a great evening. Thanks, Nick.
You're welcome. Thank you.